Good morning, fourth grade, and welcome back to school for the 2020-21 school year. I'm very excited to meet you guys. My name is Ms. DeYoung, for those that do not know me. I am the student teacher for Mrs. Horst's class, and if you're Mrs. Hunnall's class, I'm just here to read to you. So the book that we're going to start with for this year, our novel study, is going to be called Holes by Louis Sachar. I'm going to read you a little bit about what Holes is from the back cover. Always a great place to go to see what our book could be about. We're going to talk about some story predictions that we might have. Obviously, we can't talk to face to face about this, but we'll kind of talk about what we're thinking in our brains. And then we'll talk about some connections that we might have to the story. And then we'll kind of dive in a little bit and get to know our characters. So, Holes by Louis Sachar. Here is our front cover. We've kind of got a little face down here with a hat, and then we've got really dry land here with some holes, obviously, and a shovel in it. So let's read this back cover. So, Stanley Yelnats is under a curse that began with his no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather, and has since followed generations of Yelnats. Now, Stanley has been unjustly sent to a boys' detention center, Camp Green Lake, where the boys build character by spending all day, every day, digging holes exactly 5 feet wide and 5 feet deep. There is no lake at Camp Green Lake, but there are an awful lot of holes. It doesn't take long for Stanley to realize there's more than character improvement going on at Camp Green Lake. The boys are digging holes because the warden is looking for something. But what could be buried under a dried up lake? Stanley tries to dig up the truth in this inventive and darkly humorous tale of crime and punishment and redemption. So we see the word detention center in here, and I just want to let you guys know that a detention center is kind of like a jail, but it's for younger kids, so it's almost like a boot camp of sorts. And at this boot camp, basically all you do all day for your punishment for whatever crime you may have committed is you dig holes all day long, 5 feet wide, 5 feet deep, in the hot, hot, hot sun. So imagine going outside when it's 110 degrees and just digging all day long. And that's going to happen in the story, so we're going to learn a little bit more about that. Up here, we've got a couple of elements of the story, if you can see from this far. We've got a pair of running shoes, a lizard, a jar of what looks to be like some orange fruit, and a hole. Mrs. DeYoung is not an artist, but this is what we've got going on here. So these are all elements that are going to play a big role in our story. It might seem kind of like, what could that possibly mean? These strange objects that have nothing to do with each other. But as we kind of go through the story, we'll kind of see what could be the significance of these shoes and lizards and some strange fruits. So story predictions. When we make story predictions, we really want to kind of think about what we think will happen in the story. So we know that Stanley's going to a detention center, a jail for kids, where he's just going to dig holes all day. And it also gives us a little bit of a teaser here that says that what else could they be looking for under that lake? Why are they digging holes all day? So if I'm making a prediction, I want to guess what they're looking for. Maybe they're looking for a dinosaur. Maybe there's dinosaurs under the lake. People dig for dinosaurs, archaeologists, right? Maybe they're digging for a buried treasure, like a pirate ship, buried treasure. So these are the kind of predictions that we're going to kind of make. And think to yourself, what could possibly be hiding under all of that dry ground? So let's get into the story and see what we can figure out. Part 1. You are entering Camp Green Lake. There is no lake at Camp Green Lake. There once was a very large lake here, the largest lake in Texas. That was over 100 years ago. Now it is just dry, flat wasteland. There used to be a town on Green Lake as well. The town shriveled up and dried along with the lake and the people who lived there. During the summer, the daytime temperature hovers around 95 degrees in the shade, if you can find any shade. There's not much shade in a big dry lake. The only trees are 2 old oaks at the eastern edge of the lake. Lake in quotation marks. A hammock is stretched between the 2 trees, and a log cabin stands behind that. The campers are forbidden to lie in the hammock. It belongs to the warden. The warden owns the shade. Out on the lake, rattlesnakes and scorpions find shade under the rocks and in the holes dug up by the campers. Here's a good rule to remember about rattlesnakes and scorpions. If you don't bother them, they won't bother you, usually. Luckily, we live in Michigan. We don't have to worry about either of those things, because those things freak me out. I gotta tell you. Being bitten by a scorpion or even a rattlesnake is not the worst thing that can happen to you. You won't die, usually. Sometimes a camper will try to be bitten by a scorpion or even a small rattlesnake. Then he will get to spend a day or two recovering in his tent, instead of having to dig a hole out in the lake. But you don't want to be bitten by a yellow-spotted lizard. That's the worst thing that can happen to you. You will die a slow and painful death. Always. If you get bitten by a yellow-spotted lizard, you might as well go into the shade of the oak trees and lie in the hammock. There's nothing anyone can do anymore. So, first of all, we see the lizard that we talked about earlier. And we also kind of see this really dramatic part where it says that people would rather be bitten by rattlesnakes and scorpions, which is super, super painful. I'm sure most of us probably haven't been bitten by a scorpion, but super painful, burning pain. And they'd rather be bitten by those than have to dig holes in the lake all day. So if that kind of gives you a comparison of how painful and how awful it must be to sit there on the lake and just dig in the sun all day, I gotta tell you, it's probably not a great time. 2. The reader is probably asking, why would anyone go to Camp Green Lake? Most campers weren't given a choice. Camp Green Lake is a camp for bad boys. If you take a bad boy and make him dig a hole every day in the hot sun, it will turn him into a good boy. That's what some people thought. Stanley Yelnats was given a choice. The judge said, you may go to jail or you may go to Camp Green Lake. Stanley was from a poor family. He'd never been to a camp before. 3. Stanley Yelnats was the only passenger on the bus, not counting the driver or the guard. The guard sat next to the driver with his seat turned around facing Stanley. A rifle lay across his lap. Stanley was sitting about 10 rows back, handcuffed to his armrest. His backpack lay on the seat next to him. It contained his toothbrush, toothpaste, and a box of stationery his mother had given him. He'd promised to write her at least once a week. He looked out the window, although there wasn't much to see. Mostly fields of hay and cotton. He was on a long bus ride to nowhere. The bus wasn't air-conditioned, and the hot, heavy air was almost as stifling as the handcuffs. Stanley and his parents had tried to pretend he was just going away to camp for a while, just like rich kids do. When Stanley was younger, he used to play with stuffed animals and pretend the animals were at camp. Camp fun games, he called it. Sometimes he'd have them play soccer with a marble. Other times they'd run an obstacle course or go bungee jumping off a table tied to broken rubber bands. Now Stanley tried to pretend he was going to camp fun and games. Maybe he'd make some friends, he thought. At least he'd get to swim in the lake. He didn't have any friends at home. He was overweight, and the kids at his middle school often teased him about his size. Even his teachers sometimes made cruel comments without realizing it. On his last day of school, his math teacher, Miss Bell, taught ratios. As an example, she chose the heaviest kid in class and the lightest kid in class, and had them weigh themselves. Stanley weighed 3 times as much as the other boy. Mrs. Bell wrote the ratio on the board, 3-1, unaware of how much embarrassment she caused both of them. Stanley was arrested later that day. He looked at the guard who sat slumped in his seat and wondered if he had fallen asleep. The guard was wearing sunglasses, so Stanley couldn't see his eyes. Stanley was not a bad kid. He was innocent of the crime for which he was convicted. He had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was all because of his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-grandfather. He smiled. It was a family joke. Whenever anything went wrong, they always blamed Stanley's no-good, dirty, rotten great-great-grandfather. Supposedly, he had a great-great-grandfather who had stolen a pig from a one-legged gypsy, and she put a curse on him and all his descendants. Stanley and his parents didn't believe in curses, of course, but whenever anything went wrong, it felt good to blame someone. Things went wrong a lot. They always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He looked out the window at the vast emptiness. He watched the rise and fall of a telephone wire. In his mind, he could hear his grandfather's gruff voice softly singing to him. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the trees was just a little bit softer. While the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, he cries to the moon, if only, if only. Mrs. DeYoung can't sing, so I just kind of read that more like a poem. Maybe one of you probably sing a lot better than me. It was a song his father used to sing him. The melody was sweet and sad, but Stanley's favorite part was when his father would howl the word moon. The bus hit a small bump, and the guard sat up, instantly alert. Stanley's father was an inventor. To be a successful inventor, you need 3 things: intelligence, perseverance, and just a little bit of luck. Stanley's father was smart and had a lot of perseverance. Once he started a project, he would work on it for years, often going days without sleep. He just never had any luck. Every time an experiment failed, Stanley could hear him cursing his dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-grandfather. Stanley's father, who was also named Stanley Yelnats. Stanley's father's full name was Stanley Yelnats III. Our Stanley is Stanley Yelnats IV. Everyone in his family had always liked the fact that Stanley Yelnats was spelled the same, frontwards and backwards, so they kept naming their son Stanley. Stanley was an only child, as was every other Stanley Yelnats before him. All of them had something in common. Despite their awful luck, they always remained hopeful. As Stanley's father liked to say, I learned from a failure. So let's look at it real quick. They said that Stanley Yelnats is spelled the same, forward and backwards. So if we write down Stanley, and then his last name is Yelnats. This is Yelnats. If we look at it, forward and backwards, we have S, S, T, T, A, A, N, N, L, L, E, E, Y, Y. So it's forwards and backwards. That's called an anagram. Stanley Yelnats. So they really like that, I guess. So, let me find my place. But perhaps that was part of the curse as well. If Stanley and his father weren't always hopeful, then it wouldn't hurt so much every time their hopes were crushed. Not every Stanley Yelnats has been a failure, Stanley's mother often pointed out. Whenever Stanley or his father became so discouraged that they actually started to believe in the curse, the first Stanley Yelnats, Stanley's great-grandfather, had made a fortune in the stock market. He couldn't have been too unlucky. At such times, she neglected to mention the bad luck that befell the first Stanley Yelnats. He lost his entire fortune when he was moving from New York to California. His stagecoach was robbed by the outlaw, Kissing Kate Barlow. If it weren't for that, Stanley's family would now be living in a mansion on a beach in California. Instead, they were crammed in a tiny apartment that smelled of burning rubber and foot odor. If only, if only. The apartment smelled the way it did because Stanley's father was trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers. The first person who finds a use for old sneakers, he said, will be a very rich man. It was the latest project that led to Stanley's arrest. The bus ride became increasingly bumpy because the road was no longer paved. Actually, Stanley had been impressed when he first found out that his great-grandfather had been robbed by Kissing Kate Barlow. True, he would have preferred living on the beach in California, but it was still kind of cool to have someone in your family get robbed by a famous outlaw. Kissing Kate Barlow didn't actually kiss Stanley's great-grandfather. That would have been really cool, but she only kissed the men she killed. Instead, she robbed him and left him stranded in the middle of the desert. He was lucky to have survived, Stanley's mother was quick to point out. The bus was slowing down. The guard grunted as he stretched his arms. Welcome to Camp Green Lake, said the driver. Stanley looked out the dirty window. He couldn't see a lake, and hardly anything was green. So, that's our read aloud today. I'm very excited to see what happens next in the story. I'll see you guys tomorrow.